In today's episode, I'll stay in a 90-year-old log cabin built as part of a welfare program, drive along the oldest purpose-built scenic byway, and visit an engineering marvel from the second half of the 19th century. Join me as I go off-season camping at the Mohawk Trail State Forest in western Massachusetts. What is camping? Staying outdoors in a temporary shelter? What about RVs? I think staying in a pop-up could be considered camping, but what about a fifth wheel? How about a Class C or Class B or Class A? They're certainly different from a hotel. I could argue that many campers have more amenities than most motels. How about a cabin? Here's my definition. Camping is a mindset. If the idea is to commune with the outdoors instead of barricading against it, you're camping. With that definition in mind, I set off to go camping in a cabin. One of the wonderful aspects of living in New England is that we get a white Christmas. Trees are defined with snow-covered accents to show their hibernating beauty. Skating and skiing allow for outside activities. And oh yeah, it's cold. Hats, gloves, scarves, and layers of clothing cold. I can't feel my toes or fingers cold. To go camping in the late fall or winter, I decided I needed a decent heat source. Thus, I selected a cabin at the Mohawk Trail State Forest Campground. Although the separate camping area closes in the fall, the cabins are available year-round. However, they are closed for maintenance for several weeks in the fall and the spring. There's 6 cabins available, numbers 1 through 7. I was told that number 4 fell victim to powder post beetles. 4 are larger, which sleep up to 5, and 2 smaller, which sleep up to 3. I chose one of the smaller cabins. Some of these date back to the 1930s and were built as part of the Civilian Conservation Corp. I stayed in number 3, which was built in 1934. It was humbling to consider that this small wooden structure has kept people secure from the elements for 90 years. The price was $50 per night, being that I'm a Massachusetts resident. For non-residents, the price jumps to $130 per night, which I feel is a bit excessive, as I can book a room atop Whitcomb Summit with a view for as little as $30 a night more. And I don't have to pay for firewood to heat the place or walk a quarter of a mile to the bathroom. The large cabins are $75 for Massachusetts residents and $170 for non-residents. It's important to note that walk-in registrations are not allowed, but same-day booking can be handled with only 2 hours advance notice and can be booked as far out as 4 months in advance. Also, there's a premium for online booking. That fee is $4. The idea of staying in a hand-hewn cabin from a bygone era had a certain appeal for me, and I'll share my experience in a moment. But first, I'd like to talk about the CCC. During the 18th century in America, land was plentiful, and in the first half of the 19th century, westward expansion proved that there was plenty of fertile soil for anyone willing to work. By the second half of the 1800s, people like John Muir were expressing concern that all this natural beauty may not be sustainable long term. In New England, the timber industry was clear-cutting old-growth forests and leaving a blight in its wake. In the early 20th century, a world war took the nation's attention away from the land, and the 1920s saw increases in city size, less focus on agriculture, and a rise in making money. All that crashed in October of 1929. The president, Herbert Hoover, tried to make things better, But by the election of 1932, people were looking for a new deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then governor of New York, promised if elected to the presidency, he would fix the issues facing desperate Americans. The people believed him, and he set about making changes in his first 100 days in office. One of those programs was the Emergency Conservation Work Act of 1933. This created a civilian army to battle two main problems. First, protect the lands that were being taken advantage of, but not replenished, and secondly, put young men, especially from urban areas, to work. This act created what became known as the Civilian Conservation Corp. What was achieved in just 9 years is nothing short of astounding. It was a social welfare program in which the participants were given housing, food, clothing, and paid $30 a month, which would be about $600 in today's money. The hitch was that they had to agree to send $25 back to their family and could only keep just $5 of their money earned, a little over $120 in today's money. During its time, over 3 million young men aged 18 to 25 participated, with almost 500,000 men employed at its highest point. The quasi-military focused on rebuilding roads, dams, and other outdoor infrastructure, planting trees to stabilize erosion, and performed forestry management, including fighting fires. They stayed in camps, many times in buildings that the first groups had constructed. They additionally worked in relief of natural disasters, providing manpower for cataclysms like the 1938 New England hurricane. While the initial groups worked with hand tools, such as picks and shovels, heavy equipment was added to assist with larger projects, such as building roads and repairing bridges. The young men were also used to rebuild and conserve areas of natural beauty and function. It's estimated that the CCC planted more than 3 billion trees. Much of the work done by the Civilian Conservation Corps is still visible today, as many state parks are a result of their efforts. By the spring of 1942, the nation refocused its attention to Europe and the Pacific, and Roosevelt's Tree Army traded their shovels for M1s to preserve democracy in the world. Now you know. I'd like to show you around my CCC cabin in western Massachusetts, but first, I'd like to hear what you think in the comments section, and I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Rustic cabin camping is more like tent camping than one might think. With an RV, you have everything built in, often including a toilet and shower. With the cabin, there's some similarities to a camper, like bed, table, and chairs, and heat. But the toilet and shower is still a short hike away. There's an outside picnic table and fireplace, and, of course, solid walls and a roof to keep out bears and other creatures. I also had electricity, something not typical at a tent site. The wood burner is incredibly efficient. I only used one bundle of wood each day, but I can see if it was very cold that more might be needed. The electric blower kept the room very comfortable, and watching the flames dance inside the door was pleasant and relaxing. This worked much better than I suspect the original open fireplace did when the chimney was first built. I brought my stove and cooked my food. In fact, I videoed 5 upcoming recipes for my Making a Mess series in that cabin. The whole time felt like a throwback to an earlier time when people were more self-reliant. I brought 3.5 gallons of water, which was more than enough for cooking, making coffee, and washing dishes during the 2 nights that I stayed at that cabin in the woods. The park itself felt old school as well, not in a negative way, but more along the lines of hearkening back to a simpler time. Originally established in 1921, it was designed to preserve the remarkable beauty of northwestern Massachusetts, and a campground was part of its original design. I suspect that the campground had less to do with forward-thinking politicians and more to do with dealing with people who were already camping along the river anyway. So creating an area for that specific purpose would help control environmental damage in other locations. Plus, it would give better fire and waste control, minimizing dangers and spoiling the experience for others. The park's grown from the original 5,000 acres to over 7,700 and includes 4 to 500 acres of old growth forest. In these areas can be found some of the tallest pines, including the Jake Swamp Pine at over 169 feet, and the oldest trees, with some hemlocks dating around 500 years old. These trees were around before white settlers' boots trod the lands, and moccasins of Native Americans traveled the path from Mohawk and Mohican lands east to the Pukmatuck and Nipmuc tribes along what is now the Connecticut River. This ancient footpath is the basis for what has become the Mohawk Trail. Anyone who has studied history knows that rivers were the original highways of travel and eventually commerce long before roads. Two major north-south water highways of the Northeast are the Hudson and Connecticut rivers. Connecting the Atlantic Indian tribes with the Iroquois tribes of what is now northern New York and Canada was an east-west trail that ran between the two rivers. The eastern portion of it used the Deerfield River, which is on the Connecticut River side of the Hoosac mountain range. The western part of it required travel by foot over those mountains. This ancient passage was used by the warlike Mohawks to occasionally attack the Pocmatuck people, the last raid being sometime around 1665, destroying the settlement. Any survivors were scattered, and a great number of others had succumbed to disease brought by the Europeans. This same route was traveled by Metacom, also known as King Philip, to reach out to the Mohawks for support in attempting to repel the English about 10 years later. The Mohawk tribe refused. European settlers began to fill the void in the land by moving into the area and naming it Deerfield. Native Americans, primarily Abenaki, Mohawk, and some remaining Pocmatuck, along with French soldiers, made a raid on Deerfield in 1704, killing 47 and taking 112 captives to Montreal. It's hard to believe that this was the western frontier. By 1750, settlers had begun to set down roots on the New York side of the Hoosac Mountain, in what was originally East and West Hoosac, but had been renamed to Adams and Williamstown, respectively. Massachusetts maps from 1850 show a road running from Deerfield to Adams, but it was little more than a wagon way. In 1845, a railroad ran west from Adams to Troy, New York, but from Boston, the railroad ended in Greenfield, a town north of Deerfield. Goods were then packed over the mountain by wagon. It wouldn't be until the last quarter of the 19th century that trains were able to complete that trip, and the wagon trail fell into disrepair. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced an automobile for the masses. By the end of 1913, he had sold almost 330,000 Model Ts alone, not to mention the other auto manufacturers, such as the Stanley Steamer Company of Watertown, Massachusetts. America had fallen in love with automobiles. Massachusetts tourism sensed an opportunity to cater to these motorheads. In 1912, the state began construction to revitalize the old wagon trail, and in October of 1914, the 68-mile, first in the nation Scenic Byway opened to the public and was dubbed the Mohawk Trail. It wouldn't take long for roadside attractions to begin to spring up catering to these auto travelers. One of the earliest was a stop along the hairpin turn just above the town of North Adams in Clarksburg, Mass. Here could be had a meal with a view. And you still can. The Golden Eagle restaurant has been serving guests since the late 1950s when it was built further into the mountain after two separate trucks plowed into the old building within months of each other. The current owners have been to tourist needs and feeding them since the early 80s. It was closed on the days I visited, so it's still on my bucket list. Just above the hairpin, if heading east, is the Western Summit. I've been in the Wigwam Western Summit store a number of times. This is another of the earliest offerings that has been around since the Mohawk Trail was officially opened. With a spectacular view and nicknamed America's Switzerland, Yankee magazine named it in 2021 one of the top 5 places for coffee with a view. Heading west, however, is typically how most people first encounter the Mohawk Trail, with the sunrise behind you. As you travel along Route 2, you'll encounter a park on the left-hand side with a statue of a Native American appearing to welcome you. He's not. Each day, this representative of the indigenous people greets the rising sun with outstretched arms in preparation for a blessed day. Placed in Mohawk Park in 1932, the Native American has stood to welcome each day. Below the bronze edifice is the Max Anger Memorial Pool, built by what they claim is the oldest fraternal order in the United States approved by Congress, the Improved Order of the Redmen. This group traces its origins back to the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Tea Party. Continuing west, the road begins to ascend. Switching back and forth during the climb, you find yourself in Florida, and then a bronze elk appears at a cutout on the right. This is Whitcomb Summit, the highest point on the Mohawk Trail. With views looking north and west, you realize why this road has been attracting tourists for more than 100 years. As for the statue, it was placed by the Fraternal Order of the Elks in 1923 to honor its members who lost their lives in World War I. The wooden tower proclaiming views of 4 states is gone, but the hotel that has graced the peak is still there, beckoning tourists looking for a room with a view. As you continue to drive past the wigwam and around the hairpin turn, you'll descend into the town of North Adams, then Williamstown. If you've been along the coast at Salem, Boston, or Cape Cod, you'll hardly believe you're still in the same state. But people have been driving out here for the incredible scenery and natural serenity since just after automobiles were invented. Now, you know. Of course, the first road out of Boston to the northwest part of the state was not Route 2. It was the railroad. I'll tell you about that in just a bit, but first, let me talk about the amenities at the State Park Campground. Whether to enjoy cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, or just to experience the area during the off-season, staying along the Mohawk Trail in a cabin in the winter is a different experience. Firewood is delivered in advance of check-in by the staff, and there were 4 bundles when I first arrived. These are paid for when checking out at $7 per bundle used, and they can only take a credit card, no cash. The cabin comfort station housed the facilities. There's a single-stall toilet and a single-stall shower. Hot water seemed plentiful. There are also 2 sinks and a hand dryer. Outside was a sink for dishwashing, but that had closed for the winter. I washed my dishes in the cabin with the water I had brought, and then took the dirty dishwater with me to the bathroom for disposal. Because of a concern of bears, trash had to be brought down daily to a dumpster placed behind the office area, and there was also a location for disposal of small propane cylinders and empty butane bottles. I'd also like to mention that other activities are available during the regular season, such as several companies that provide whitewater rafting tours, and there's the 100-mile Mohican Mohawk Trail that covers parts of the original Native American pathway. The Mohawk Trail region also offers several self-paced driving tours on their website that will expose you to the highlights of the area. One of the most fascinating places to visit, however, is the east end of the longest passage through a mountain this side of the Mississippi River, the Hoosac Tunnel. In trying to build the rail line to connect Boston to Albany, New York, they ran into a mountain range which would require steep vertical climbs. Trains like gradual climbs and gentle descents. The Hoosac Mountain offered none of that. Similar to the children's song, Going on a Bear Hunt, the engineers decided, let's go through it. This would be easier said than done. As early as 1819, the proposal had been floated, but the ability to cut through nearly 5 miles of solid rock would take engineering skills and tools not yet invented. Nevertheless, in 1848, a commitment of funds was being collected to build the tunnel at a cost of $2 million, and work began in 1851. The project was started with hand drills and gunpowder, and progress was slow. At the start of the Civil War, 10 years later, the tunnel was less than 1 mile complete. In 1863, the state took over the project due to financial missteps of the construction company, but soon realized they needed better engineers and hired Walter and Francis Shanley of Canada. The tunnel would take an additional 13 years to complete, but was considered a major civil engineering achievement. It was the first tunnel to replace gunpowder with nitroglycerin for blasting, and the first to substitute hand drills with pneumatic drilling machines. The inaugural run of a train rolled through the completed tunnel in 1875, just under a quarter of a century after the work began. The estimated financial cost of the project rose from $2 million to $21 million, and the cost in human lives is around 200. It's said that the ghosts of the workers who died still haunt the tunnel, but that's a different YouTube channel. Although the last passenger train through the 4¾ mile hole through the mountain was in 1958, as many as 5 freight trains a day make the run from the west, from Albany or Troy, New York, or east from Boston, Fitchburg, or Worcester. There was a collapse in the west end of the tunnel in 2020, but that closed the tunnel for a short 2 months while the repairs took place. I'd like to share a story that I've been told about a death that didn't happen when building the tunnel. Back around 1868, transport of nitroglycerin was dangerous business, as it was a powerful explosive but unstable when jostled. The Deerfield Dam had frozen during the winter of 1868-69, and William Granger, a civil engineer attached to the tunnel project, had determined to clear it with the use of the explosive liquid. He had several vials of the yellow compound packed with sawdust into a compartmented wooden box and set off on his sleigh across the mountain. As the weather turned sour, his horse stumbled and the sleigh slid sideways. Granger attempted to correct the skid by leaning, but alas, the rig tipped on its side, spilling the driver and box of precious explosives into the snow. The engineer must have thought what a fool he'd been, as he was certain the result would be heard for miles, and that his body would be scattered amongst the trees. He stumbled into the snow and prepared to meet his maker, but all he met was a face full of white frozen crystals. As he arranged himself, he was stunned to learn that the box had broken, but the vials had not, and were frozen solid. He packed them back into the sleigh and continued to the dam, where he discovered that the nitroglycerin would not explode until it was thawed and returned to liquid. After this, nitroglycerin was cooled to a solid state and safely shipped for miles to be used in the building of America. Now you know. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the Mohawk Trail State Forest Campground and camping in a CCC cabin. Please subscribe to be kept up to date with new videos as I release them, including my Making a Mess series on outdoor cooking using a mess kit and shelf-stable ingredients without refrigeration. Until next time, get outdoors.